Okay, this little presentation is to give some general feedback on the assignment. So I've got this in three parts. So the first of these videos will talk about fairly specific but important things. The next one will talk about how to construct your argument and a model for doing that. And the third one will talk about issues of formatting, which I'll also touch on briefly here. Okay, now the first thing I want to say is that I am really impressed at how many of you got these in on time. So what that means is that you're on top of your work, you're planning your time, you're not using lateness to kind of in a way that will impact on your other studies. So it's really important to work around the deadlines that we give and to make sure that that you're balancing the various demands in your life in that way. So it's good to get things in on time. The other thing in terms of content is that basically pretty much everything I've read has engaged with the text in the way that we want you to do it in a close reading exercise. So you've quoted from the text, you've referred to it in detail, and you've used that to form an interpretation. Some of those essays only do it in a very limited way, and we've tried to encourage in our feedback, your individual feedback, how to do that more. But others have done that more extensively, and they tend to do better. So we're off to a good start with the close reading exercise. One of the big problems is, in terms of structure, is the introductions aren't really working for a lot of these essays, or they're not adding much. So an introduction shouldn't have a lot of content or a summary of the essay, and they certainly shouldn't have the conclusion of the essay. So they should be there to explain the context, and in an exercise like this where everyone knows the text and where it comes from, you don't even need that. But importantly, the approach. So an outline of how you're going to answer the question, how you're going to show what your interpretation is, but not an outline of what you're going to say, because we can read the essay, we know what it's going to say. So it's about how you're going to prove your point rather than what you're going to say. Okay, so the other thing is that with some of the essays, there's a lot of complex sentences and complex terminology that's being used. Now, that's not a problem in itself, but you have to be really, really, really careful, firstly, that you're not misusing the words or misusing the phrases, so that you're being very accurate. And accuracy is usually better achieved through something simpler. And the other thing is that we're not really interested in how clever you can say something. We're interested in your ideas and your argument. So sometimes the kind of complex language and the convoluted sentences, they get in the way of showing what might be a really good idea. So keep it simple. Don't try to sound clever for the sake of sounding clever. Try to say clever things about the text and use the text as evidence for them. And moving on from that, it's really important that the evidence proves your point. So there's always a risk that your analysis might move on, that you make too much of the text, or that the points that you're making aren't well connected with the evidence. I'll talk about more of this in the next presentation. But basically, let the evidence do the work for you. The quotation from the text and descriptions of what's going on, but use that to make an interpretation. Okay, so, and a related point too is that you should make sure you know the meaning of a literary term before you use it. So there are lots of things, even simple literary terms like irony, that people are using in ways that are not standard, let's say. So it's really important that you know what you're talking about, so just look it up in a proper dictionary. If you're on campus or have access through the library, you can look up the Oxford English Dictionary, which usually gives a very good and usable definition of these things. Now, in terms of referencing, I talked about this quite a bit in my lecture on essay writing, but you should be citing only peer-reviewed papers. So basically, they're things that you can find through the library website. You shouldn't be using other students' papers. You shouldn't be using just random websites, blogs, and certainly not things like school resources. We're at university now. So have a look at that lecture on essay writing if you're unsure about how that works. And if you follow the first result from a Google search for your paper, for the topic of the paper, it certainly won't be original, the answer that you come up with. So, it's better to rely on your work of understanding the text and making an argument than just finding the first thing that appears on Google. Okay, so I'd encourage you to look at the other two presentations I'm going to give for more detailed feedback on how to do these things. There are a lot of problems still with formatting, and the third of these will talk about that in detail. But the really hard thing at this stage is how to construct an argument, and so I've tried to help you with that with the second of these presentations.